Hello, Sophia here. This tutorial will show you how to make 5 different mini succulents out of polymer clay. If you don't want to do all 5, you're welcome to just skip forward to whichever succulent you're interested in making. Keep in mind that this is a very time-consuming process. It took me about 3 hours to make all 5 of these succulents. So just have patience, have fun, take breaks. And again, if you just want to do a couple of them, that is totally okay. I hope you enjoy this tutorial and I'd love to see your results. The materials that you will need for today are obviously your polymer clay. So I have some various shades of greens and yellows in here. I also have some white and some fun colors for the pots. And then you'll also need some various tools. Toothpicks are really going to come in handy, so if you have toothpicks or anything pokey like a needle will work too. I have an X-Acto knife, any sort of knife should work. I also have a roller and a flat cutter, and then also just some other random tools. Then I also put parchment paper down, which is super helpful because it prevents the clay from sticking. So I'm going to start by mixing the color that I want for the pots. So I have this kind of off yellow. I'm gonna mix them with some white to make it like a light creamy yellow. So to mix colors together, I warm up each individual color separately first, so it's easier to then blend them together. And then I just kind of knead it together and keep twisting and turning it until all the colors are mixed together thoroughly. To form the pot shapes, I'm first going to roll out a very thick coil. So I'm starting with it in between my hands and then I'm putting it down on the surface. And I'm trying to roll it out as evenly as possible and just roll it out to the thickness that you want your pots to be. So how wide you want them to be. So once you have your desired thickness, I'm going to take my cutter tool. You can also just use a regular knife too. I'm going to cut off the very tip so it has a flat edge, and then cut it again at however tall I want the pot to be. And then I'm just going to kind of smooth out the edges and make sure it's nice and circular. Then I'm going to cut it again for another pot. This pot's going to be a lot taller. And again, just smoothing it out and rolling it some more just to get it a little bit slimmer. And I found that if you kind of roll it as you're cutting it, it will stay more circular. Rather than if you just cut it without rolling it, it will kind of flatten the edges a little bit. So that's a good trick. And for the third pot, I want it a little bit wider, so I'm gonna kind of squish it down a little bit and then re-roll it and cut it with a flat edge. And then just kind of keep smoothing it out and forming it to the shape that I want. With your extra scraps, you're going to reform those into a little ball in your palms and then roll it out into a thin coil. And this part's optional, it's just to add some extra detail and flair to your pots. So I'm gonna add like the little ledge at the top of the pots. So roll it out pretty thin and try to keep it really consistent. And then I'm gonna cut off one end so it's flat and then just place it right at the top edge of the pot. Then once I get around, I'm going to cut it so it fits the pot perfectly, and then smooth out that seam And then I'm just going to kind of press it down into the pot a little bit so it's a little flatter around the edges. And if you have any sort of like flat tool like this, it can be really helpful to kind of flatten it out a little bit more. Then I'm just going to do that same thing on the other two pots. For the first succulent, I chose this bright lime green color. So I'm just warming it up in my hands and then forming it in a ball in my palms. Then I'm going to roll it out into a coil, trying to keep it as consistent as possible. And I'm rolling it out into a pretty thin coil, like about a 1/4 inch thick. Then I'm going to take my cutter tool, again a knife will work fine, and I'm going to cut little tiny pieces from that coil. And I want to cut 16 pieces total. I want 10 of those pieces to be a little bit bigger and 6 of them to be slightly smaller. And that doesn't matter a whole lot, but it will help you in the end to get them all together. So now I'm going to form each of those little pieces into a leaf shape. So I'm squishing down on them and then forming one side into a point. So kind of like a teardrop shape. And then just continue that process for all of the rest of the pieces. Then it's time to start placing them on your pot. So I'm going to put them right along the edge, and I'm going to do 5 at the base. So I'm going to take the larger ones that I have and just put them evenly across. And then I'm just kind of pressing down on the base to ensure that they stick to the pot a little bit. Then I'm going to take another 5 and I'm going to put those next layer of leaves in between the base ones. So I'm going to kind of stagger them so that they go in between. And again, I'm going to do 5. And then again, pressing down the base of those leaves a little bit so that it sticks better. And I'm just going to add a little ball of clay into the center there for a little bit more support. So now I'm going to take my smaller leaves and I'm going to put 2 together, and then I'm going to put the other 4 wrapping around those 2 centered ones. And then I'm just going to place that directly in the center and kind of squish down the base so it sticks a little bit better. And this part can be kind of tricky to get into without squishing your other leaves, so just be patient and careful. This next part is completely optional, but if you want to add a little bit more color and detail, I'm using chalk pastels. And I'm gonna take a spare piece of paper and a tiny brush and an X-Acto blade. I'm just gonna scrape some pigment off of the chalk pastel to form this kind of powder. And then I'm taking this super small brush that's still dry, and I'm just gonna apply that powder to the very edge of each leaf. And if you don't have chalk pastel, but you still want to add a little bit of detailed color, you can bake them first and then go in with acrylic paint and add that detailed color after you bake them. And this part takes some time and patience, but it's worth the end result. So for this next one, I chose my taller pot and a darker green. So I'm warming it up in my hands and forming it into a coil. And this one's going to be a tall cacti. So I cut off one end for a flat base on the pot. And for this one, I decided that I wanted to add some soil into the pot because you can see the base. So to mix brown, if you don't have any brown, you're going to take red, yellow, and blue. And you're just going to start with a lot more yellow and then just a tiny bit of blue and a tiny bit of red. And go ahead and mix those all together. And I could already tell that it was too blue, so I decided to add some more yellow to lighten it up a bit. And it was still too blue, so I added more red and more yellow. So mixing colors is really a process, and you just have to keep adjusting it to how you want it. So if you want a lighter brown, add more yellow. If you want warmer tones, add more red. And it's pretty forgiving because you can just keep adding little bits of color until you get your desired shade. So I finally came to the brown that I wanted. So I'm gonna rip off a little piece and then form a small little ball in my palms. And then I'm gonna flatten that out just by pinching it. And then I'm gonna measure that against my pot surface. So I want it to be about the same size as my pot. And it fit pretty well, so I'm just gonna lightly press that on there. Then I took a toothpick and I added some texture to make it look more like some dirt. So I just did a bunch of little pinpricks using the toothpick. So I liked how that looked on the dirt. And I just kind of formed it on there so it was pretty stuck on. Then with that extra bit of green, I rolled that out into a thinner coil and then cut a piece off and added a little arm to the cactus. And then I decided to cut that into an even smaller coil and added another arm up top. And then I rolled an even thinner coil and did another little baby arm at the top. So you can really play around with it, and you know, it's fun to work three-dimensionally because you can do the arms on all sides, as many or as few as you want. And then I just kind of tried to smooth out that connection and make sure the arms were really stuck on there. Next, to add some detail and like the impression of spikes, I'm taking my toothpick And I'm just gonna do little dots all around the entire cactus. And then I decided I wanted to add some little flowers to the ends of each arm of the cactus. So I rolled out a really thin little coil, and then I'm taking my toothpick and I'm just adding on little bits of that coil to the end. So I'm cutting little like dots off almost, and then just applying that to the very tip of each arm. And the toothpick is super helpful because it's such a fine point and you can really get in there with the little details. And this part is super tiny and detail oriented, so this part is completely optional. For this next cactus, I chose kind of a bluer green. And then I wanted to add the dirt like I did with the last time. So I just rolled out a super small little ball and squished that into a circle and applied that to the very top of the pot. And then I did the same technique with the toothpick to add some texture. Then with my green, I'm gonna roll that into a coil in my palms first, and then on the table. So I'm gonna roll it out into a long, fairly skinny coil. Again, trying to keep the thickness as consistent as possible. And I just cut it in half because it's easier to deal with than it's hard to roll out a really long, consistent coil. So then I just cut a little piece off about 1 inch wide, and I tried to stick it on there and it just kind of flopped over. So lesson learned on this next one, I cut it a little bit smaller and I didn't flatten it out. And then that one stood more upright. So it can be kind of hard to get the first leaf to stand upright on its own without any support. But once you get the second one on there, they can kind of lean against each other and then it just gets easier from there. So I just kept cutting little pieces off in various lengths and just sticking them down, kind of tacking them down onto the dirt and leaning them against each other so that they stand more upright. And then I did kind of longer leaves in the middle and then some shorter leaves around the outside. So I just had some fun with like playing around with size and kind of adjusting them to like turn different ways and flop over, and you can just yeah, keep playing with it until you get the results you want. And then I decided that I wanted to add a little bit more dirt around the edge to kind of hide like the base of the plants. So I rolled out a really thin coil of brown and then just put that around the base and squish that down a little bit. Then I used the same technique that we did on the first succulent. So I took some dark blue chalk pastel and I just kind of scraped some off with a X-Acto knife into a powder. Then I'm using that small brush again, still keeping it super dry. And then I just applied that carefully to the tip of each leaf. So for these next 3 succulents, I decided to use gray for the pots. So I just mixed a little bit of black into white, and then I rolled it out and cut it into little pieces and smoothed it out, and just did the same method that I showed at the beginning of this video. For this succulent, I'm going to do one of those flat round cacti. So I'm using this lighter shade of green. I mixed a little bit of my leftover gray into it to kind of dull the color down. So I just rolled it into a ball and then flattened it out a little bit and cut off one end so that it has a flat base to attach it to the pot. Then I'm going to again add a little ball, a little bit smaller than the other one, and I'm going to flatten that out and shape it how I want and attach on the arm. And I'm just going to smooth out that attachment there so that it's stuck on there well. Then I decided I want another little arm, so I rolled an even smaller ball and flattened that out, and then attached that to the other side slightly lower down. And then again, I'm just gonna smooth out the attachment. And I wanted to add little baby flowers to the ends of it, similar to that previous cacti that I made. So I'm taking that same red color and I'm gonna roll it out into a super thin coil. And then I just cut off tiny little pieces of that so that I just formed really, really small little balls. And then I attached that onto the ends of each arm, just however many you want in whatever place you want. So as you can see, I'm just cutting off tiny little bits from that coil and sticking it on. Now to add a little bit more detail, I'm going to take my toothpick again and I'm just going to do little lines of dots. So I started with one directly down the middle, and then I did 2 on either side as well. And then I'm just going to do 2 lines of dots for the arms of the cacti. And then I flipped it over and I did the exact same thing on the back. Then I just chose which pot I wanted that to go on, and I'm gonna add some soil. So again, I took a tiny little ball of the brown, rolled it out into a circle, and then just squished it in between my fingers and made sure that it matched the right size with the pot, and then flatten that down. And I also added some texture with the toothpick, like I did with the other ones as well. And then I just attached it on, and that one's done. For this next plant, I'm gonna do one of those little round cacti. So I'm gonna start with a darker green, and then after I've warmed it up by kneading it, I'm gonna form it into a small circle in my palms and just measure that out against the pot that I want to use. So I made it a little bit smaller and actually switched pots as well, and that one fits pretty well. So then I just patted it down so that it's snug on there. Now I'm going to take a lighter green, so I just mixed that same dark green with a little bit of white. And I'm going to coil that out into a long skinny coil. Then I'm just going to lay it across, starting on one side all the way to the other side, and break it off. And then form like an X or a T across it. And then just pat down those coils. Then I'm taking this kind of like needle nose tool, and I'm making an indent on the center. And then I'm just poking little dots along that lighter green coil that we added. And that just gives it some texture and makes it look kind of like spikes. And next I'm gonna add a flower. So I'm using that same red I did with the other ones, and roll it out into a pretty thin coil. And then I'm just gonna cut off tiny little pieces, about 1/4 of an inch each. And I'm gonna form a little flower out of those. So I'm using this tool to build the flower on, just because it's easier to hold than on my finger. So I'm just taking those little chunks and attaching them together. So I did one in the center, and then I'm gonna do 5 around that one. And this part is kind of tedious and really small and detail oriented, so if you want to skip the flower, that's totally okay as well. But so I just kind of squeezed those little chunks all together, and then took it off of my tool, and then made the indent in the cactus a little bit bigger to fit the flower better. And I just placed it in there, and then kind of tacked it down into the cactus. Okay, and for this last cacti, I'm gonna add a little bit of soil. So once more, I'm just rolling out a very small ball of the brown and just patting it down to form a circle that fits on there well, and tapping it down, and I'm gonna add some texture. I chose this really light lime green color, so I added some yellow and white to my green. So I'm gonna roll this one out into a medium-sized coil. Then I'm gonna cut little pieces off. So I'm gonna do several smaller pieces, and then a bunch of slightly longer pieces as well. And then I'm just gonna kind of smooth out the edges, and I'm gonna pinch one side and roll it so that it's a little bit skinnier on one side and looks kind of like a teardrop. And then I'm just going to place those in the pot. I'm going to start along the edges and just kind of form like a flower shape with these leaves. So I'm just laying them right snug up close to each other, trying to keep them like evenly distanced, and just laying them around the perimeters. And if you run out of petals, you can always just roll some more coils. So before I add my next layer, I'm gonna press the centers of each one down a little bit. And you can kind of reform it to how you want. Then I'm gonna go in with my little bit of a smaller piece and add those into the center. And just like pressing down the bottoms as I go. And I'm gonna kind of place them like in between the other ones so that they're kind of staggered. And for the finishing touch, I'm gonna do that same technique with chalk pastel. So I just scraped some off from an orange into a powder and then carefully applied that to the ends of each leaf. And then once you're done, it's time to bake. So bake your pieces according to the directions on the packaging of your specific polymer clay, because they all vary a little bit. If you don't have the packaging for directions, bake it at 275 degrees for at least 15 minutes, and then leave it in the oven until the oven completely cools off naturally. I would place the polymer clay on a cookie sheet with some tin foil or parchment paper down so you don't damage the cookie sheet. And then also open a window and turn a fan on because it can get a little bit stinky sometimes. After you've taken them out of the oven, they still might seem a little bit soft, but let them cool off completely and then they should harden up. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you liked how your succulents turned out. Like and subscribe for more videos. Have a wonderful day.